The morning they dragged Wren Calloway into the center of Redrock's Main Street and called her a liar, I was standing 30 feet away with a cup of cold coffee growing colder in my hand. I watched. I did nothing. And that silence, that single, spineless moment of quiet would cost me the next 2 years of my life and nearly everything I had ever loved. Her name was Wren Calloway. She was 23 when she rode into Redrock with a single saddlebag and eyes the color of a storm front rolling in from the mountains, that particular shade of gray-green that is neither one thing nor another. She had a jaw that could cut glass and a voice so low and measured it seemed to carry its own gravity. The women of Redrock whispered about her from the first day. The men stared. I, for my part, tried very hard not to do either. I was Eli Voss, rancher, 31 years old, owner of the Copper Bell, 340 acres of mostly flat grassland with an unreliable creek and a cattle herd that had been more promise than profit for the better part of a decade. People trusted me with their problems. People did not expect me to be the source of them. She didn't come to me looking for work. Everyone who had ever walked through the gate of the Copper Bell came with their hat in their hand and a rehearsed story. Wren Calloway rode up to the fence on a roan mare, studied the state of my north pasture fencing for 30 seconds and said without looking at me, "Your third post from the left is healed over. If you don't brace it before the autumn winds come through, you'll lose 40 feet of line and probably 12 head with it." I looked at the post. She was right. I said, "I know." She finally turned and looked at me and said, "My name is Wren Calloway. I've worked 3 ranches in Texas, 2 in New Mexico territory. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for fair wages and a place to sleep. If I don't earn both in the first month, you can let me go without argument." I had told myself I was going to say no. I didn't need complications. And there was already, in the 5 seconds I had been looking at her, a flicker of something uncomfortable in my chest that I was not ready to name. I said yes. She extended her hand and we shook on it. Her grip was firm and dry and brief. I noticed more than I should have in that half second, and then I let go and walked her to the bunkhouse and told her she'd start the following morning. She was extraordinary at the work. Within a week it was obvious, and within 2 it was almost embarrassing. She was up before dawn every day. She handled the horses with a quietness that bordered on uncanny. She could walk up to an animal that had been shying from everyone all week and have it settled in under 2 minutes, just by talking to it in that low, unhurried way she had, as if they were having a reasonable conversation between equals. She didn't talk much to the hands. She was polite but contained, like a river that runs fast and deep and close to its banks. When she did speak, it was usually practical or unexpectedly dry, a remark delivered so neutrally it took you a second to realize it was funny. I watched her the way you watch a fire you're not sure you should have lit. Not constantly, not obviously, but with a persistent awareness of where she was in any given space. It was the creek that started it. My creek flooded its west bank every October and drowned the south fence line. I had been fighting that problem for a decade. By the time Wren had been at the Copper Bell for 6 weeks, she had walked the bank 3 times at different water levels and come to me with a solution so elegant and simple that I was half angry at myself for not seeing it. We dug it together over 4 days, just the 2 of us. We talked the way people do when they're working side by side with their hands occupied and their eyes not required to meet, honestly, without the social performance that comes with sitting face to face. I learned she had grown up in West Texas, daughter of a sheep rancher who died when she was 15, that she had been largely on her own since then, that she preferred the company of horses to most people, that she read voraciously, that she had a weakness for bad weather. "I like things that are honest about their nature," she said one afternoon, wiping mud from her forearm with a rag. "A storm doesn't pretend to be a clear day. I can work with that." She was standing 3 feet away from me when she said that, ankle-deep in creek mud, her hair escaping its braid in the heat, and I thought, then I am already failing your requirements, because I was not being honest about my nature. I was calling everything professional interest, calling it ordinary, calling it anything except the plain name it had. On the 4th evening, when the channel was cut and the creek was running where we told it to, we sat on the bank as the sun went down and the sky turned the color of a bruised peach. We didn't talk much. We were both tired in that good bone-deep way. Wren picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water 5 skips, clean and even, and then handed me one without comment. I missed on 3. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. I kept it in my memory like a pressed flower. Redrock had 314 people, and every one of them had opinions. The woman who had the most was Adelaide Fitch, who ran the dry goods store and had appointed herself the moral temperature gauge of the town. Adelaide decided that Wren Calloway was trouble. She couldn't say exactly why, and that vagueness, rather than giving her pause, only deepened her conviction. By November, a story had grown and was traveling that Wren had stolen money from a rancher in New Mexico territory and fled ahead of a warrant. Nobody knew where this story came from. Nobody asked. It had the quality of all rumors in small towns. It felt true because it explained the discomfort people already felt. Wren heard about it. Of course she heard about it. She came to me on a Wednesday evening, the only time she ever knocked on the door of the main house, and said, "I imagine you've heard what they're saying in town." I had, she said, none of it's true. My last employer tried to underpay me for 3 months of work. When I refused to accept less than what we'd agreed, he told the county I was difficult. That's the whole story. She said this without heat, without appeal, without excess emotion. Just the facts laid out like fence posts, straight and evenly spaced. I said I believed her, immediately, without hesitation, because it was true. She looked at me with something complicated in her expression, gratitude, and also a tiredness, the tiredness of someone who has had to account for their own truthfulness too many times. Then she thanked me and left. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk back to the bunkhouse in the dark and thought, I should go to town. I should tell Adelaide Fitch and anyone else who will listen what I just said to Wren's face. I should use whatever small authority my name carries in this county and lay this rumor flat. I didn't. I told myself I would next week, when the timing was better. I told myself it would only make things worse if I seemed too eager to defend her, that people would read things into it. I told myself all of this with great sincerity, and every word of it was a lie I was telling, so that I didn't have to examine what I was actually afraid of, not what people would think about Wren, but what they would think about me. The harvest dance was held the second Saturday of November. Wren came, wearing a dark blue dress I had never seen before that made something knock against the inside of my ribs in a way I found profoundly inconvenient. Her hair was down for the first time. She looked, standing in the doorway of Harmon's Hall with the lamplight behind her, like someone who had walked out of a painting. We ended up standing near the side wall, not quite together and not quite apart, watching the dancing with that comfortable silence we'd developed over months of shared work. I said, without planning to, "Do you dance?" She looked at me and something moved through her eyes briefly, a weather change, and then she said, "I used to." The way she said it closed that particular door quietly but completely. What I did not understand, not until much later, was that the declination was not about the dancing. Adelaide Fitch found Wren near the refreshment table and said, loud enough for 4 people to hear, "I'm surprised Eli's still got you on at the Copper Bell, given the stories." Wren went very still in the way she had of going still when something required management, the stillness of deliberate restraint. She said evenly, "I don't put stock in stories, Mrs. Fitch." Adelaide said, "Most honest people don't need to say that." And then she smiled the smile of someone who believes they've won something. I was 6 feet away. I heard every word. I watched Wren hold her ground with a quiet dignity that she had clearly cultivated over a long time, and I thought, say something now, use your name and your credibility and lay this to rest right here. Adelaide Fitch turned and saw me standing there. She was waiting to see what I would do. Wren turned too, and for 1 second our eyes met. Hers said nothing, perfectly composed, perfectly uninviting of rescue, and I said nothing at all. I let the moment pass. The look on Wren's face when she turned back around was subtle, the kind only someone paying close attention would catch. A small adjustment around the eyes, a compression of the mouth, the look of someone who has just had a hypothesis confirmed. I have thought about that look nearly every day since. Something changed after the dance. Wren was still excellent at the work. She still showed up before dawn and handled the horses and managed the fence repairs with clean competence. But the silence between us, which had been comfortable, became something different. It had weight in it now. She stopped staying after supper to help with the dishes. She stopped coming to the fence to talk when I was working the south pasture. She was professional and courteous and present. But the particular quality of her presence, that warm attentiveness she had offered me in increments since the creek work, was gone. Javier Reyes had been at the Copper Bell for 11 years and had seen me through 2 bad winters and a drought and my father's death. He sat down across from me one December morning and said, "You are making yourself miserable, Eli, and it is unnecessary." I said I didn't know what he meant. He said, "You know what I mean." He refilled his coffee and sat back down and said, "She is a good woman, she works hard and she is honest and she is better company than most people I have known. She is also not happy at the moment, and neither are you, and the distance between those two unhappy people is something a man could walk across in about 30 seconds if he had the courage for it." I told him it was more complicated than that. He said, "It is never as complicated as we make it. The complicated part is almost always just fear with a better wardrobe." Then he said something that had the quality of something he had been holding back and had decided the time had come for. "Eli, she has been watching you for 3 months and she has seen a man she trusts. She does not trust easily, and she trusted you." And then in front of a room full of people, when it cost you nothing to simply say, "I know this woman's character and what you're saying is not true," you stayed quiet. She is not angry with you, she is just less certain of you, and that is a harder thing to repair than anger. I sat with that for a long time after he left. The fire in the wood stove went from crackling to settling. The winter light through the window moved from cold yellow to early gray. I sat there and I let myself finally, fully, look at the thing I had been performing elaborate maneuvers to avoid looking at. I was in love with Ren Calloway. It was not an infatuation and it was not a passing thing. It was the specific, particular love of someone who had come to know another person slowly, honestly in the language of work and weather and long silences and small gestures, and had found them extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the way of performance but in the way of character, steady and honest and strange and brave and profoundly, stubbornly themselves. She told me she was leaving on a Thursday morning in January, standing in the barn doorway with the cold light behind her. She said she'd found work at a ranch over the Cimarron Way, more responsibility, slightly better pay. She said she'd stay through the end of the month to make the transition easier. She said all of this clearly, looking me in the face the whole time, giving me the full courtesy of her honesty even at the moment she was removing herself from my life. I said, "You don't have to go." It came out flatter than I intended. She looked at me carefully and then said very gently, "Eli, I think I do." And in those 4 words was the whole unspoken conversation, not anger, not blame, but the quiet sadness of someone who has understood something clearly and is acting on that understanding. I went to town that afternoon. I went to Adelaide Fitch first. I said, "Adelaide, I need to say something to you about Ren Calloway and I'd be grateful if you'd pass it on to anyone you've discussed her with. The stories about her stealing are false. I know this because I know her character. Ren Calloway is the most honest and capable person I've employed in 10 years. Whatever Harlan Greer told the county about her, he was a man who underpaid a woman for hard work and blamed her for refusing to accept it. I should have said this in November. I'm saying it now." Adelaide looked at me for a long moment and then said with a dignity I actually respected, "I'll pass it on, Eli." I found Ren at the south fence line the next morning. I walked over to her and said, "I went to town yesterday." Something moved in her expression, quick and involuntary, and then was still. I said, "I told Adelaide Fitch and everyone else I should have told in November that the rumors about you are false and that I know your character and stand by it. I should have done it then. I didn't. I'm sorry, Ren." She looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Why didn't you?" Not with accusation, with the straightforward desire for understanding that was just part of her nature. I said, "Because I was afraid, not of the town, of what it would mean to defend you, what it would say about how much I cared about what happened to you. I was afraid of that being visible. I was afraid of what I'd have to admit to myself if I let it be visible. That was cowardice and it cost you something and I can't undo it. But I'm trying to stop being cowardly now even if the timing is terrible." Ren was very still, the listening kind of still. She said quietly, "What are you saying, Eli?" The question was careful, not because she didn't understand, because she needed to hear it said plainly. No ambiguity, no retreat. I said, "I'm saying that I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd week you were at this ranch, and I have spent the subsequent months finding increasingly elaborate ways to avoid knowing that out loud. I'm saying that you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and that I understand if what I failed to do in November has made that impossible for you to receive, and that I'm not telling you this to ask you to stay or to change your decision. I'm telling you because it's true and because you deserve to know it and because I've spent enough of my life being silent about things that mattered." I stopped, I waited. The winter light fell across the grass between us. Ren looked at me for what felt like a very long time. Her composure was still there, but something underneath it was shifting, coming to the surface, the way ice shifts on a river in early spring. She said, "You should have said this a long time ago." I said, "I know," she said, "and the silence in November hurt, not just my pride, it hurt because I trusted you and I needed that trust to be real." I said, "I know. It was real, it just wasn't brave enough yet." She was quiet again, then she said very carefully in a voice that had dropped to almost nothing, "I don't want to go to the Cimarron." We stood at the south fence line and talked for 2 hours. She told me that she had known since approximately the same 3rd week that something was happening between them that she didn't have easy language for and wasn't sure she trusted. That she had a history of investing in people who, when it came to anything that cost them, chose the comfortable option over the true one. That she had watched me at the dance and measured the distance between what she thought I was and what I did, and that the measurement had come up short, and that she had started protecting herself the way she always protected herself, by withdrawing the parts of her that were vulnerable before they could be made to regret it. She told me that she was a woman who had come to understand her own nature slowly and with some difficulty. That the things she felt, the way she felt them, hadn't always had words in the places she'd lived, hadn't always been safe to examine too closely. That she had learned to be careful with herself the way you're careful with something valuable in rough country. That what she felt when she was with me was something she didn't want to be careless about, on either side of the risk. She said, "I don't need you to be perfect, Eli. I need you to be honest, even when it costs you something, especially then. I've been watching you all this time trying to decide if you were the kind of man who could do that, and then in November I thought I had my answer. She looked at me directly. But you came to town yesterday and you came out here this morning, and I don't think cowards do those things. I said, I'm trying not to be one. She said, I know. And she took one step forward, the remaining 3 feet between us, and just stood there close to me in the cold winter air, not quite touching, the proximity itself a statement, a question, an opening. I reached out slowly with deliberate care and took her hand, just that, her hand in both of mine. She looked down at our hands and then up at my face, and the thing that had been shifting under the surface of her composure finally came fully through, something warm and unguarded and real. The face she had behind the face she showed the world, the one I had been catching glimpses of for 3 months in unguarded moments. She said, You're still making this up as you go. I said, I'm absolutely making this up as you go. She said, Good, me too. And she squeezed my hands just once with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything. The cold light lay across the grass like a benediction. I don't know how long we stood there, long enough for it to be real. She didn't go to the Cimarron. Things changed at the Copper Bell slowly, and with a certain amount of awkwardness that is probably inevitable when two careful, private people navigate the gap between one kind of understanding and another. We remained, in most respects, the same people, the people who worked well together and talked easily, and shared a quality of silence that had always felt like its own form of communication. The difference was in the layer beneath all that, the layer that had been present and unnamed for months, which now had a name and was no longer required to pretend it didn't. By the time the spring thaw came and the creek ran fast and clean through the channel we cut together, Redrock had largely decided that Wren Calloway belonged. The Harmon girls decided she was their favorite person at the ranch. Javier taught her 3 of his mother's recipes, which he had shared with no one in 11 years. Even Adelaide Fitch came to the ranch one May afternoon and apologized, not elegantly, not without discomfort, but sincerely, and that was what mattered. Wren accepted it with warmth that meant she was choosing not to carry it forward, making room for the town to become something other than the place that had called her a liar. One evening in June, we rode out to the mesa top at sunset and sat at the edge and watched the light change and the shadows lengthen across the valley below. She turned to me and said, What are you thinking? And I said simply, without any of the old elaborate evasion, that I'm glad you rode through the gate that Thursday. She looked at me with those storm-gray eyes and then she smiled, not the almost smile. The real one that reached all the way up, that changed her whole face. She said, The fence post was a disaster. I said, It really was. She said, You should have fixed it 3 weeks earlier. I said, I know. She said, You're going to let me manage the fencing from here on out, aren't you? I said, I think that would be best for everyone involved. She took my hand with that quiet, certain, uncomplicated warmth, and we sat there on top of the world in the last of the light over the Copper Bell and the creek and the fence line and all those acres of ordinary, difficult, beautiful life. The stars came out. We stayed.